Hola, ¿cómo están? Soy Eduardo Barros, socio y fundador de EveMetrics y EveConsulting y también profesor de la Escuela de Negocios de la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez. Tengo el honor de presentarles a Nancy Tippins. Nancy es una destacada psicóloga organizacional de Estados Unidos y tremenda contribuyente a distintos ámbitos de la psicología organizacional en ese país y en el mundo. Ha publicado una serie de libros sobre cómo se hace la selección bien hecha y también ha trabajado en asociaciones similares a la Red de Recursos Humanos, particularmente en la SIOP y en la Sociedad Americana de Psicología. Nancy obtuvo su doctorado en el Georgia Institute of Technology, también conocido como Georgia Tech, y dentro de sus contribuciones estaba haber participado en los estándares y principios para la validación de procesos de selección en Estados Unidos, que tiene una influencia incluso a nivel legal. Nancy tiene una experiencia aplicada de casi 40 años y hoy, estoy seguro, nos va a inspirar con ideas muy relevantes sobre cómo se hace la selección bien hecha y basada en la ciencia. Nancy, muchas gracias, muy bienvenida.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Before I start, I just want to say buenos dias. I'm afraid to say anything more in Spanish, but I do want to tell you how pleased I am to be here with you today. I hope Google Translate has worked correctly and that I've not said anything offensive or funny. I just want to thank you for being here. I'm going to stick to English now. Today's talk is going to give you an overview of developing a selection program that meets organizational goals as well as the goals of that an organization has for its selection systems. To be successful, a selection program has to be aligned with the organization's goals and the requirements of its selection program. You can have an excellent selection program, but if it doesn't support the corporate goals, it's of little use. So let's dig in a little bit and look at corporate goals and selection goals more closely. Corporations and organizations have many different goals. Some are focused primarily on shareholder value. Other organizations are purpose-driven and work to achieve some purpose. There are a lot of ways to attain profitability and maintain stock value. A company can achieve shareholder value through organic growth or through acquisitions. And you can grow your business vertically, for example, by building or acquiring the natural resources that are required for the manufacturing process, or you can acquire the distribution process and sell your product directly to customers. You can also expand horizontally by acquiring related businesses. Think about the Disney empire that encompasses movies and theme parks and cruise lines. All of these are different forms of entertainment. Some organizations have to create shareholder value by divesting themselves of an unprofitable business, freeing up cash to invest in other, more profitable lines of business. And other times, the company must turn around a failing business. It merits noting that some organizations are purpose-driven, which is not necessarily in opposition to shareholder value and profitability. Some businesses have both types of goals. These organizations strive to fulfill some goals or conduct business in a particular way. I'll say more about this in a moment, but I think it bears repeating. It's really, really important to understand these purpose-driven organizations because the purpose will have an effect on what should be measured in the selection system. Here's an example. Several years ago, I worked for a large hospital system whose purpose was faith-based. They wanted to hire people who viewed their work in the hospital as an opportunity to serve God. As you can imagine, there were some extra job requirements for this hospital that were different from those of other hospitals that were more focused on profitability or on research. While the research hospital might be interested in innovation, successful candidates in this hospital that was faith-based had to have not only the skills for their medical specialty, but also a commitment to serving other people. Like organizations, selection systems also have goals. An overarching goal for most systems is fairness, treating all candidates equitably so that you have an accurate evaluation of each individual's strengths and weaknesses. Fairness is important for two reasons. One is you need accurate information about your applicants, and two, you want your applicants to feel they have been treated fairly in the selection process. Another critical goal for most selection programs is predicting something that is important to the organization. Usually it's job performance, but it can be components of job performance, things like predicting accidents, service orientation, teamwork, or it can be other job-related behaviors like turnover and absenteeism and malfeasant behaviors like theft. Most businesses want selection processes that support the employment brand and promote positive applicant reactions to the test and to the organization. You want people to accept the job if it's offered, and you want people to continue to buy your products and services. I want to briefly mention legal risk. In some parts of the world, particularly the United States and South Africa, there are stringent laws that dictate what you can and cannot do with respect to employment testing. I would also mention that in the European Union, there are stringent privacy laws that affect what data can be accessed and shared. So if your selection program is global, you need to be aware of the laws in the places where you test people. Most organizations want efficient selection programs that provide value for the money they spend. Rarely do organizations select only one goal. Many require at least two. They want accurate prediction and they want an efficient selection process. And most want to also include positive applicant reactions. This is what makes the job of the HR professional so difficult. There are trade-offs that have to be made. The cheapest test may be the absolute worst test for your organization. And the most accurate test may take a long time to administer and be off-putting to applicants. A test that measures cultural fit well may engender negative reactions from your candidates. You have to have a clear idea of your organization's priorities, and you must understand the characteristics of the test that you are considering. You try to match, but often you have to make a compromise somewhere. Rarely are you able to choose the best test relative to all criteria. So there are lots of different tests on the market, and you're probably familiar with most of these. We don't have time to talk about any of them in depth, but suffice it to say that these forms of assessment differ according to how well they meet the goals we just talked about. How well they predict job performance, or that's what we call validity, the strength of that prediction, how the applicants might react, and how efficient and how much they cost. Here are a few examples of the dilemmas that we face in making these choices. Cognitive ability measures have the highest meta-analytic validity of any other measures. A meta-analysis produces an estimated validity by aggregating multiple studies and correcting for certain types of errors. The estimated validity for cognitive ability tests is higher than other tests, regardless of the job. In fact, cognitive ability tests actually predict better for higher level jobs. If you want to choose the best test for your organization, the best starting place is likely to be a measure of general mental ability. Cognitive ability measures vary tremendously in cost. A multiple choice measure of inductive reasoning or verbal reasoning is relatively inexpensive, but a complex business case that requires role players and has complex scoring can be quite expensive both to administer and score. A big drawback to cognitive ability tests are negative reactions some applicants have. Some applicants are worried that their lower mental abilities are going to be exposed. Others are offended that their education and their experience doesn't speak for themselves. Personality tests have lower validities than cognitive ability tests, but they're generally easy to develop, administer, and score. They're usually inexpensive, and nevertheless, some applicants find that they are intrusive. Others are concerned that they are fakeable, and they worry that they won't get a fair shake in the employment process if they answer honestly. Artificial intelligence-based tests seem to be taking the world by storm right now. They're often highly efficient. In some applications, the individual doesn't even have to answer a question when the data are scraped from resumes and applications and social media. Yet the level of prediction for these types of tests is often unknown. And even when there's evidence regarding how well they predict job performance or another criterion of interest, that information is often not shared with the client. Recently, I've tried to validate several of these tests, and I've been unable to establish a relationship between the test score and job performance. Statistics for the models are acceptable, but the test score job performance relationship is not significant. There are also a number of issues regarding fairness and applicant reactions to variables that are beyond the control of the person. For example, facial features and voice quality. Sometimes people are concerned that the variables used are out of date. When data are pulled from the internet, social media like Facebook, is it fair to use information that might have been posted 10, 15 years ago? And there's also a concern about using data that is not ostensibly job related. Does it matter what I did at a party last year? Oftentimes, candidates do not know what is being measured, but if they do, it's sometimes hard to explain why something is important and relevant to a job. My favorite example is one test I looked at said that a single course in theology was related to performance in a sales job. Some of these games use variables like the position of the cursor on the page, and it's difficult to understand why that's relevant to job performance in most, if not all, kinds of jobs. So, what are the characteristics of an effective assessment? Well, number one, the assessment program needs to be job relevant. It measures KSAOs, which is knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics or competencies that are necessary for job performance. If you measure job-relevant competencies, you are more likely to be able to predict future job performance. Also, an effective test must be psychometrically sound. There are a number of dimensions of psychometric soundness. One of the most important is reliability. The test should return an accurate evaluation of the person, regardless of the number of times the person's taken the test, the location where he or she took the test, the person who administered the test, etc. Another element of psychometric soundness is the item difficulty. You want items that measure multiple levels of difficulty. A test that is too hard or too easy won't tell you as much relative to a test that covers multiple difficulty levels. I should point out here that there are standards for tests in general and employment tests, and these give you a good idea of the psychometric expectations. One set of standards is called the Standards for Educational and Psychological Tests. It's written by the American Educational Research Association, the American Psychological Association, and the National Council on Measurement and Education. These cover standards for tests in general. In contrast, the principles for the validation and use of personnel selection procedures focuses on employment tests. This was written by the Society for the Industrial and Organizational Psychology. An effective assessment engages the test taker and produces positive reactions. We don't want the test taker to believe the test is measuring irrelevant things or permits cheating that disadvantages those who don't cheat. We want the test taker to believe he or she has been fairly evaluated against the requirements of the job. We also want the applicant to feel the test is measuring job-relevant skills in an efficient manner. We don't want to abuse the time of the applicant and have an overly long selection process. We also want the test to support the employment brand. If a purpose-driven organization wants to convey that it is committed to serving its customers, the test should reflect that idea. Perhaps the content of the item suggests service, such as an item that might be found in a situational judgment inventory, or perhaps it's in how the applicants are treated during the testing process. If the business wants to be known as a cutting-edge organization that embraces new technology, then the testing platform should reflect that. And all of these criteria must be met in a manner that meets the constraints of the employment process the organization has. Almost every organization has limits on how much it can spend on assessment and how many people can be assigned to the assessment processes. Some organizations cannot afford to bring in candidates for testing, and they have to rely on unproctored internet testing. So if you have a test that requires proctoring, it will not work in that context. Your choice of test has to be consistent with the organizational constraints. I want to make 2 points that I believe are critical for anyone who's responsible for a testing program. One is that tests are neither good nor bad. The right test for you depends on how well the test works for your job, your organization, and its circumstances. You can't go to a vendor and say, I want a good test. You have to say, I want a test that meets my requirements. And I think the second point that's really important is that you cannot assume a test will work for your organization. You've got to have evidence. You've got to explore how well this test works in your situation. So what should you consider when you are choosing a test? The first thing I consider is the job requirements. What are the tasks performed by the job incumbents, and what KSAOs, knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics do you have to have in order to perform the job? Once I know the KSAOs, or perhaps the competencies, I compare the requirements to what the test actually measures. If the job requires problem solving, I don't want a test that measures teamwork. Related to job requirements and test content is the coverage of the job domain. How many of the job requirements do I want to measure? All of them? Only the most critical ones? The ones that are most likely to differentiate good and bad performers? These are very complicated questions and they have some technical answers. But in general, the more you measure, the more accurate your prediction is going to be. But often, the more you measure, the more expensive and time-consuming the process becomes. So you have to look at each of the components of your possible selection process and determine how much they contribute to the overall prediction, and then decide what to keep and what to discard. What I don't want to do is to settle for what a test offers me. This may or may not be the right thing for me and my company in my specific circumstances. I frequently see tests that purport to measure a large number of constructs. In some cases, this large test is deficient. It doesn't measure critical KSAOs that are necessary for the performance of the job I'm working on. And in other cases, the test measures things that are not relevant. There are a lot of things that are being measured that I don't need and don't want to use. I also want some indication of the predictive power or validity of the test. I want to know what studies the vendor has conducted, and I want to know if they're credible. Was the sample size adequate? Was the criterion measure acceptable? I want to know whether or not the sample that the research was conducted on is similar to the job that I'm developing a test for. The results are not useful if the validity study was conducted on workers in a manufacturing line and I'm trying to evaluate a test for first-line supervisors in a call center. All vendors should have evidence of validity that supports the use of their test. Be very suspicious if the vendor has no documented evidence. And be cautious if the vendor has evidence that does not align with what we know from the testing literature. For example, most analytic test validities are in the 0.2 to 0.5 range. An observed validity, and a validity you get out of a study done in the field that's higher than 0.50, is extremely unusual. So if someone tells me the validity of their test is 0.6, I need to see the details of that study. There are a number of factors related to actually delivering the test, and it's critical that the test you choose or the test that you develop or perhaps you modify can be developed, administered, and maintained in your environment. You may need testing professionals available to you if you're going to develop your own test. You may need a certain type of administrative personnel if you use a simulation or a work sample or an interview that has to be scored by a human. And also consider the maintenance of the test. Who's going to monitor test usage and tell you when the results suggest your test has been compromised? Who's going to determine when items need to be replaced or perhaps the entire test needs to be replaced? Think, too, about the environment in which you're going to administer the test. Do you need individual offices for an assessment center, or do you need special equipment for an electronic repair test? I once had a physical abilities test that required climbing a telephone pole. It's very hard to install a telephone pole in an office building. And there were no trained personnel who could administer the test out in the field. So I had a test that did not fit my environment at all. If you work in a company that has legal restrictions, make sure you are aware of them and understand how to comply with local laws and regulations. And then finally, think about what the applicant reactions are likely going to be. Will the applicant be offended to know that his job offer was contingent upon his facial features? Will the applicant be okay playing games to determine her qualifications for a management job? And how will the applicant feel about being interviewed by a computer? One of the essential questions that we as testing professionals have to answer is whether or not there is evidence that the test score does what we want it to do. Specifically, does the test score predict job performance or some other relevant criterion for a specific job in my company? The process for establishing this evidence is called validation. And validation is essential if you want to be able to demonstrate how well your test works. Without validation, you don't know. And who wants to pay for a test that doesn't work? This slide shows a general validation process. It begins with a meeting to confirm exactly what's going to be done, who's going to do it, what the timeline is. Next step is a job analysis, which determines which tasks are performed by incumbents and what the KSAOs or competencies are that are required to perform those tasks. Some people will tell you that a job analysis is passé. There are lots of ways to conduct a job analysis, and there is no other way to systematically and accurately define job requirements. Job analysis is not passé. It is a systematic method for determining the KSAOs or competencies that you ought to be measuring, and it's a critical step in the validation process. I think job analysis is particularly important when your organization is highly purpose-driven because you need to focus on the O in KSAO, the other personal characteristics, in addition to the knowledge, skills, and abilities. You need to determine what kind of person is going to fit into the organization and support its goals and its purpose. Note that I've inserted several checkpoints in my graphic. It's important that clients see the results to date. There's a project review after job analysis. Occasionally, I've done a job analysis and something has gone wrong and needs to be corrected before I choose a test and start the validation process. I once did a job analysis on a mechanical job, and the incumbents told me through a job analysis questionnaire that they did not need mechanical knowledge. Sounds a little unusual, doesn't it? It's not clear to me what went wrong. Maybe the reading level was too difficult for the incumbents, or maybe they were just teasing me, pulling my leg in some way. Managers and my own observations confirmed that mechanical knowledge was required. Regardless of what the cause was, it was a problem that had to be fixed. At this point, you're ready to select a test that measures the critical KSAOs, or competencies. It's important to review the test with the client here to make sure it's going to fit with their operational needs. Make sure they are aware of what the test requires and how they're going to have to use it. Then you want to validate the test scores. In other words, you're going to establish a relationship between the test score and the outcome you're trying to predict. There are two ways to do this, and I'm going to dig into this in the next slide. After you validate, the next step is to review the results. I find there are lots of decisions that have to be made here, and they're everything from which tests and scales to actually use in the final test battery to what cutoff scores should be used, where are you going to set the bar for qualified and not qualified, and even how long the test might last. The next step then is implementation, and this is sometimes a neglected step. The person who helped you develop the test says, okay, here it is, go for it, and you're not quite sure what to do. It is important to the success of the program that you implement the test well. And there are lots of details to take care of. For example, you need to make sure that people are properly trained for their role, whether it's administration or scoring. You need to make sure that you have scoring and data collection processes in place. You want to make sure that you have reporting capabilities both back to the candidate as well as to the hiring manager and other people in the organization who have a need to know about the test results. And finally, you want to make sure that your test is documented. And there's several reasons to do this. Number one is you may not be in the same job forever, and there are other people who will come behind you and they will need to know what was done. Also remember that some components of a job analysis serve other purposes. For example, the identification of KSAOs and competencies in the job analysis may also serve as a guide for training efforts. And then finally, the information that you pull out of a job analysis today may serve as a foundation for the job analysis that you need to do 5 years from now when you want to update your test. So let's talk a minute about what validation actually is. There are two types of validation processes that are commonly used in employment testing. One is called Criterion-Related Validation, and the other is called Content-Oriented Validation. Both begin with a job analysis to establish the requirements of the job. What are the tasks that are performed and the KSAOs that are required to perform those tasks? Then a test is selected for validation. In criterion-related validity, criterion data are identified and collected. Usually this is job performance ratings, but it could also be sales data. It could be key performance indicators. It could be the number of accidents. It could be the number of days on the job before somebody quits. Then a statistical relationship between the test score and the criterion score is established. In content validity, instead of a statistical relationship, you have subject matter experts who make judgments about the relationships among the task, KSAOs, and test. There are actually two sets of linkages that are made. One is the task KSAO linkage, and the subject matter experts are asked to answer the question, to what extent does each KSAO needed to perform each task? And the second set of linkages is based on the question, to what extent does this test measure each of the important and critical KSAOs? So, where does assessment fit into the employment process? There are lots of places an assessment might be inserted into the hiring process. This is one example. Start with the sourcing strategy. And you might move on to evaluation of minimum qualifications, often occurs in an ATS. Minimum qualifications are frequently focused on things like experience, education and degrees, certifications, licensure. Sometimes it can be willingness to work kinds of qualifications. Are you willing to work the third shift? Are you willing to work rotating shifts? Are you willing to work outdoors in the cold or in the heat? Some organizations include a screening assessment that's often unproctored. Sometimes this will be a personality inventory that's unaffected by the opportunities to cheat. You can put your best foot forward regardless of whether there's a proctor or not. Some organizations use a structured phone interview. Sometimes all they want to find out is how well the individual communicates. Other times they want to know more about past experiences, and they're going to ask questions about the kind of customer service that you offered. The next step is often what we think of assessment, and that is a selection battery. It could be a battery of tests. It might be a work sample or a simulation. Sometimes it's a full-blown assessment center. And then there's often a structured interview. Many jobs require a structured interview. I think it's the most common selection procedure that's used. Once you've done all this assessment, then you would go on to the onboarding process. Some organizations theoretically could use all of these assessments, and others would only use one or two of these. But regardless of how many you use, each needs to measure a job-relevant KSAO or competency, and it should be a valid predictor of the criterion that you're interested in, like job performance. So, most organizations do not have the resources internally to develop and validate a test and create a platform on which to administer that test and score it. Therefore, you're going to need to use a vendor. However, choosing a vendor can be a very difficult thing to do. It's often hard to determine the quality of the vendors. Here's a list of questions I've created that might help you determine whether or not a vendor is going to be useful to you. I'd like to start with asking people, what are your credentials and your experience in the testing area? I don't care if you are an electronics expert. I need to know that you understand testing and employment testing specifically. I also want to know the qualifications of the other people who are going to work on my assessment program. Are they skilled in what we're asking them to do? What does the test measure is a fundamental question. I want to make sure that the test you're offering has some relationship to my job. What kinds of items and formats does your test incorporate? Is it a multiple choice test? Is it a unstructured response test? Is it an interview? How does this test work? I want to know a little bit about the history of your test. For what jobs has it been used? And what kinds of validity did you find in the past? I want to see the technical documentation. And again, vendors that don't have technical documentation are extremely problematic for me. I want to know, does the test comply with the existing standards for employment tests? I want to know how you propose to conduct a job analysis for my job. And how are you going to go about doing a validation study? What kind do you recommend? Why do you recommend it? I need to know about the timing of the test. How long does it take? I need to know about the training that might be required for the people in my company to administer and score it. What kind of testing environment is recommended? If it's an unproctored internet test, are we okay with that and the attendant problems, things like cheating and compromise of test material? How is the test scored? And how do you store the test results? What kinds of reports do you give the candidate, the hiring manager, and other people? Cost is a big factor. How much does this test cost? I encourage you to dig down on the cost issues. What does the cost cover? What's included and what's not included? Are you offering job analysis and validation services? Are they included in the fee? If not, if you don't offer these services, whom do you recommend? And how much would it cost if you did it? What would you do? And what would I be expected to do? So those are some of the questions that I think you need to ask your vendors to ensure that you are getting the right test for your job. I want to stop here now and see what questions you all have.
Nancy, thank you very much for this presentation. It was very clear, very interesting, and I have several questions for you. We're not going to have the time to cover them all, but it'd be great to be able to cover some of them.
Okay.
So, great. So to start with, you talk a lot about validity. Validity is something that companies in the region are really not doing with frequency. It's very rare to find that. So the emphasis on effectiveness hasn't been present in the region, even in large companies. What would you recommend for the region in order to start paying attention to effectiveness and validity? What would be the first steps?
Well, I think the first step is to think about your job requirements. Your job requirements need to drive your testing program. So doing a job analysis can be as easy or as difficult as you want it to be. You don't have to have hundreds of people. There are many techniques to use that require only a few people. So think about job analysis and also think about content validity. It's a wonderful approach to ensuring that what your test measures is related to the job requirements. Mm-hmm. You don't necessarily have to do a criterion-related study. It is certainly very persuasive, but oftentimes you don't have that. Those are big undertakings, and a lot of times you don't have the sample sizes. So start with the easy things first and then work up to the more challenging procedures like criterion-related validation.
Very good. Now thinking of smaller companies. If you have smaller companies and they don't have really formal processes for selections, they do it in a very intuitive way, what would you recommend for them to start having more standardized, more selection procedures or methods?
Yeah, I think that all companies can benefit from the use of selection procedures. You want to make sure that you have a capable workforce. And in fact, I argue that smaller companies need selection procedures even more than larger companies. If you have 20 employees and you have one bad employee, that person is a lot more damaging than if you have 1,000 employees and one bad employee. So what do? It is difficult when you're a very small company, but I contend you can always go to reputable vendors and talk to them about tests that are well developed and for which there is a lot of evidence of their effectiveness. I think that you still have to go back to this idea of job analysis and content-oriented validity to ensure that you fully understand the requirements of the job and that you have created a link between what the test is measuring and what your job requires.
Great. That's very interesting, because I would assume that most companies in the region, the small ones, really don't want to. Not they don't want, but they don't know how to start. So those are great ideas. Now, I want to use some of my experience as a university professor. Once a group of students told me the following. They heard about, artificial intelligence-based test. And they said, now that we have artificial intelligence, this is basically the death of the classical approach to selection. So what do you think about that? Is it really artificial intelligence gonna make disappear the most traditional type of tests?
No, I don't think so. I think artificial intelligence has a lot of potential. There are many positive things about it. But today, many of the artificial intelligence-based tests have not been proven. There is not a strong relationship between the score that's produced and some criterion of interest, like job performance. And until it's proven, you really have to be skeptical about using it in your organization. In addition, I think that AI-based tests raise major questions about fairness. I talked a little bit about the kinds of items that cause people concern. Some of these tests rely on your facial features. I was surprised to know that I have 22 places on my face that can be used to predict my job performance. I don't understand that. Maybe it works, but I need some evidence that it does. I need some evidence that the quality of my voice works. What bothers me about those kinds of measures is that I have no control over the way I look or the way I sound. And so I think many of us question, is that fair? If I have certain kinds of disabilities, I may be able to perform the job, but I may look different from other people or sound different from other people. I think that AI will continue to be explored because many employers are going through hundreds, if not thousands, of resumes, and they need some sort of fast, efficient way to triage those resumes and determine whom should I push through the hiring process. I think it's also often used to go to places like LinkedIn or other social media to find people who might have the skills that are required by your job. But there's much work to be done before it's ready for prime time.
Great, very clear. So basically, you need to get evidence that whatever you have as a method, it works. I have another question coming from students. Once a group of them heard about gamification and games used in the context of selection testing, they told me, obviously, gamified assessments are going to be more fun. So again, is this the end for more of the most traditional type of tests?
Well, not all games are fun for all people. Some people find them quite challenging and difficult and frustrating. But I think even among the people who find them fun, there is a lingering question in the backs of their minds and about how relevant is it. The fact that I can push things around on a screen to make a path, is that related to my ability to be a good first-line supervisor? The fact that I can click on numbers that pop up accurately, does that have any bearing on my ability to provide good customer service? So I think that there's a tension between engaging the applicant and making them think, oh, this is a great, fun place to work, and also making that applicant feel that they have been treated fairly in the employment process and accurately evaluated.
Mm-hmm. Perfect, very clear. I'm going to take something from your presentation that made me think a lot. You said that we cannot assume that a test that is working today is going to work in 2 more years because many things can happen. And I've seen in the country, basically, the vendors not paying much attention to that. So what would you recommend in order to do the follow-ups for a test that is that works correctly on 22, but it might not work correctly or as well in the future? What would be your recommendation?
Well, I think you have to monitor your test. You cannot make the assumption that once I've got a test, it's going to be good forever. The key for me is, when does the job and the job requirements change? And when does the environment in which the job is conducted change? So imagine that you have a manufacturing job and you have a test that works quite well today. What happens when you change the equipment tomorrow? Sometimes when you introduce new technologies, the jobs become easier, and sometimes they become harder. What happens is the machine does the easy stuff, and the hard stuff are the things that the machine can't think through fast enough to to fix. So the job of the people still working in that area is much, much more difficult. So you have to constantly monitor the job and its requirements. Sometimes the applicant pool changes. If in 2008, when we had a major recession, you had all kinds of people applying for your jobs who were very well qualified. Today in 2022, in many places in the world, you can't find people to even apply for your job, and the people who do come tend not to be as qualified. So a test that worked well in a highly qualified population may not work as well in a population that is much less qualified.
Very, very interesting. I think that's a huge challenge for the market in our region and in Chile in particular. And I have, I think we are almost running out of time. So I have one more question for you. What would you say is the single most important feature of a selection system if you want to have a good, positive candidate experience? What would if you had to pick, what would be that particular feature?
Well, the research says that whether or not you pass the test is the most indicative of your future applicant reactions. However, I don't suggest that you have a test that everybody passes. That would not be good. That would be problematic. I think when you get beyond who passes or fails the test, the most important thing is something that we call procedural justice. Does the test appear to be a fair evaluation of my skills and abilities, and are those skills and abilities related to the job? That if you have that, then people tend to be more positive in their reactions to the test and to the employer. There's been some interesting research lately. A lot of recruiters believe that longer selection processes are related to candidate dropout, that people get frustrated, they get tired, they say, we're not going to do this anymore, and they leave. The research is not bearing that out right now. It appears that people who feel that the process is fair are willing to engage in it and stick around. So I would say that the fairness issue is probably the most important thing that you can ensure positive applicant reactions.
No doubt about it. Nancy, it's been a pleasure for me to have you here and listen to your presentation, and listen to your answering our questions. So thank you very much. I think that you're going to inspire a lot of people. We have a lot of work to do in South America in general, and at least I'm inspired by your work to keep working in this area. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it very much. Good luck to you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.